The second half of our small subsection here on high availability and disaster recovery in Hyper-V is going to focus on high availability through a feature in Hyper-V known as live migration. This is a great feature that allows us to easily move a running VM from one host to another without any service interruption. So we're going to jump right into the virtual lab and take a look at how to work with all three of these migration methods. We'll cover live migration, shared nothing live migration, and storage migration. Let's do it. We have a big lab to work with in this nugget. We have AdminNug, our remote administration machine, where we'll be spending all of our time in this nugget remotely managing all of these servers. We have two Hyper-V hosts, HV1NUG and HV2NUG. We've got two VMs running on HV1NUG right now. We'll be live migrating them over to HV2NUG. One of our VMs will do with a shared nothing live migration, and the other one will do a storage migration and then a live migration. Of course, we'll cover the differences between all three of those as well. And then we also have a file server. We're going to need shared storage here to do a true traditional live migration. And then, of course, we have our domain controller here tying it all together. So let's start on AdminNug and log in. Let's begin by getting right into Hyper-V Manager. We'll right-click on the Start button, head up to Run, type in virtmgmt.msc, and it should automatically connect us here to HV1NUG. And let's begin by getting both of these machines online right from the start, and we'll leave them on throughout the rest of this nugget. Now, before we go any further, let's enable live migration on both of our host machines, and then we'll break down the differences between them, and then we'll start performing them. So let's start here on HV1NUG and go right in to Hyper-V settings, host level settings here. So we're looking for the live migrations node about halfway down there in the server configuration, and we need to enable both incoming and outgoing live migrations on this machine. When we check that box, the first thing we need to do here is determine how many simultaneous live migrations we're going to allow on this machine. It will default to 2, and that's a good number for us here. Of course, that's going to depend on how many VMs that you have running, how many live migrations you're going to perform, how often you're going to perform them, and of course, how many resources and how much bandwidth you have in your environment. Next up, we can choose which network we want to use for incoming live migrations onto this host. Now, this is something that you may want to do in a production environment, especially if you plan on doing a lot of live migrations, because this is a bandwidth intensive process, especially when you're talking storage migrations. So you may want to isolate that traffic onto its own network or put it on a network that can handle it. And you also may want to do this for security reasons, because all of this data will go across the wire unencrypted. Now we're good here, so we're going to use any available network for live migration. Another thing we can do here, if we expand, hit the drop down here for live migrations, we have some advanced features. This is where we're going to configure authentication as well as performance options. Let's start with our authentication protocols, beginning with CredSSP. Now, this is the easiest of the two because it doesn't require any extra configuration. That's the advantage. The disadvantage is you must be on your Hyper-V host when performing these migrations. And that's because CredSSP doesn't support the double hop scenario, only a single hop. So that means we couldn't kick off live migrations from our AdminNug machine that we're on right here, because it would carry our credentials over to HV1NUG, but HV1NUG would not be able to double hop or carry those credentials over to HV2NUG. So this is why we would need Kerberos. Kerberos does support double hop, and it's more secure, but it also requires an extra configuration. We're going to need to set up constrained delegation in Active Directory for both our computer accounts, HV1NUG and HV2NUG. And that's what we're going to be doing because we want to perform these live migrations on our remote administration machine here. So we're going to be using Kerberos. Next up, we have our performance options from least performant to most performant. TCP/IP is the least performant because it's just going to take the memory of our VM as is and transfer it over to our destination host. It's not going to be doing any optimizations whatsoever. So that's going to consume a lot of bandwidth. Compression will trade in CPU on both the source and the destination host for a savings in bandwidth. So it's going to use the CPU to compress on your source host and then the CPU on your destination to decompress. Our final and best option in most cases is going to be SMB. This will use SMB3 to copy the memory of our VMs over to the host. And if you have RDMA on both of your NICs and both of your hosts, it will use SMB direct for the ultimate in performance. Let's go ahead and choose the second option here, and that completes our configuration of HV1NUG. Now we're going to do the same thing over on HV2NUG. So let's click on HV2NUG, head into Hyper-V settings. We'll choose live migrations. We'll enable it. Make sure you choose to use any available network here for live migration. Expand it. In advanced features here, choose to use Kerberos, and we're good there with compression. All right, so both Hyper-V hosts are now configured for migrations. Now there is one more thing we need to do since we configured Kerberos as our authentication method, and that is set up constrained delegation for the computer objects in Active Directory for both HV1NUG and HV2NUG. So let's right-click on that Start button, head up to Run, and type in dsa.msc. That'll launch us into Active Directory users and computers. Now let's start with HV1NUG. Let's double click to go into the computer properties of HV1NUG, over to delegation, and now we're going to choose the third option here, to trust this computer for delegation to specified services from HV2NUG. So we're going to hit the add button here. We're going to hit users or computers, and we're going to just type in HV2 here, hit check names that'll resolve to HV2NUG, and hit OK. And this is going to list all of the services on that machine. What we're interested in here is CIFS. This we need for the storage migration part of it. And if we scroll down a little bit here until we see Microsoft Virtual, the second one we need is the system migration service. So you want that one and CIFS. And I didn't hold control down. There we go. So now we got both of them highlighted, and we can hit OK. And that second one is for live migration, which migrates all of the state of our VMs, the memory, and anything else that's running. So there we go. And if you hit expanded here, it'll show that it includes both the NetBIOS name as well as the fully qualified domain name for both of these services. Now, there is a bug in Server 2016. This will actually not work. And that's because Microsoft changed underneath the hood how Hyper-V communicates remotely. It used to be over DCOM. Now it's using WinRM. So this is a bug. We cannot actually use Kerberos only here. We need to use any authentication protocol. So make sure you choose that. I'm sure that'll get fixed in a future release. But for now, you must choose this second one or live migration will not work. All right, we're good here. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And now we need to do the same thing over on HV2NUG and set up constrained delegation for HV1NUG services. So let's go ahead and hit the tab there for delegation. We'll choose to trust the computer, choose to use any authentication protocol. Hit add down here, and we're going to browse over to HV1NUG services. So I'll start typing in HV1, hit check names to resolve it, and OK. And now we need CIFS there again for storage migration. And then if we scroll down, we need the Microsoft Virtual System Migration Service here for the VM's running state. All right, so that looks good. We'll go ahead and hit OK. And now we're set up for constrained delegation on both of these machines. Let's hit OK once again. And now we're done with configuration. Kerberos is configured, and live migrations on both hosts is also configured. Now, before we go any further, let's cover the differences between these three types of migrations. First up, we have a live migration. This is where we want to migrate just the VM, not its storage, from one Hyper-V host to another. So let's say we've got CoreNUG here running on HV1NUG, and we want to live migrate over to HV2NUG. Live migration requires shared storage to work because it doesn't touch this layer at all. And this is why it's the fastest of all three migrations, because it just simply copies the running state of that VM over to the destination host. It doesn't have to worry about the storage because it's shared storage. The second migration type we have is a shared nothing live migration. This does not require shared storage. As the name implies, this is going to copy both the state of the VM as well as its local storage over to our host machine. So this does take a while because this is essentially a live migration and a storage migration in one. It needs to migrate both the running state of the VM and our storage over to our destination host. So that's why a shared nothing live migration is really a combination of both of these. A storage migration is just migrating the storage itself over to your destination. So let's head back into Hyper-V Manager and take a look at how to accomplish all three of these. Now, the first one we're going to do here is a shared nothing live migration. And that's because right now, both of these VMs are using local storage. So we're going to do a shared nothing live migration of CoreNUG, and then we'll do a storage migration to take GUI-NUG storage and move it over to shared storage over on our file server, and then we'll do a live migration of GUI-NUG, just the VM over to HV2NUG. So the end result is eventually we're going to get both of these machines without any interruption at all over onto our secondary host using all three of these methods. And let's start here with CoreNUG. In fact, let's get a process going so we can prove that there's no interruption whatsoever. Let's connect to CoreNUG. All right. And let's just go ahead and log in here. And let's throw a ping on a loop here. So we'll do a ping with the T switch, and let's just ping, how about dcnug.nuggetlab.com. And by the way, both of these Hyper-V hosts have an external switch which these are hooked up to. So our VMs are on the physical network, which is why we can hit our domain controller. So we're just going to let this run. We'll let it go. And while that's going, let's perform a shared nothing live migration. So all we need to do here is go back into Hyper-V Manager, give CoreNUG a right click, and choose Move. This will launch us in to the wizard. So we're going to choose Next at the Before You Begin page here. Next up, we're going to choose Do we want to move the virtual machine or the virtual machine storage? The first one here is a live migration and a shared nothing live migration. The second one is a storage migration. So we're going to choose the first one since we're doing a shared nothing live migration and hit next. Here we just specify our destination Hyper-V host. We know that's HV2NUG, so we can type it in. You can also browse Active Directory there and hit next. Next up, we need to choose where all of this data is going to live on the destination machine. And by all this data, I mean the virtual disk attached to our machine, our smart paging file, checkpoints, and the virtual machine configuration files. All of that data that is associated with our VM. The first option is the simplest here. It's going to move it into a single location that we specify here on the next screen. The second one allows us to pick and choose for every single one of those items where they're going to go. And the third one here is a live migration, where you're not worrying about the data, you're just simply moving the virtual machine. And as the message states here, your hard disk must be on shared storage. So I'm going to choose the second one here just to show you what it looks like and hit next. Now we can choose to move all of this data automatically and reuse the locations that we have here on HV1NUG. And since we have identical locations for HV1 and HV2NUG, we have a V volume over there with the VMs directory, we would be okay with this option. But I want to show you these other options here. The second one is just going to allow us to choose different locations for the hard disks themselves. And we have 2 disks attached to that machine. The third one will allow us to choose a location for all of these data points. So our virtual disks, our virtual machine configuration, checkpoints, and smart paging. And if you hit next here, it's going to list all of those components. You can pick and choose here which ones you want to configure. And if you hit next again, you'll configure it for each one of those areas. I'm going to go way back here because we're going to keep this simple and just move it all to a single location and hit next. And we'll specify that location over on HV2NUG is the VMs directory on the V volume. And there it is. And we'll hit select folder and next. And that's it. We hit finish, and as long as everything is configured properly, this should work. And we can actually hit the status here, and we can see that it's moving the virtual machine and storage. So it's doing a shared nothing live migration. And if we take a look at our VM, look at that. It's still running. Everything is still functioning normally. And what we should see here is eventually our connection window will go away. It'll ask us to reconnect. And once we do reconnect over on HV2NUG, this ping command should still be running. So this is going to take about 5 to 10 minutes to run, and I'll be back when it's done. Oh, and by the way, if you're following along in the virtual lab here, you can actually see your progress under status. If you expand this, you can see a percentage. So it'll give you a better idea of how long it's going to take. So I'm at 10%, and now I'm just going to let that go until it completes. All right, so mine just completed. Notice in the background here that CoreNUG is gone. It's off of HV1NUG. My virtual machine connect window just asked me to reconnect, so I will do that. Notice here that it says CoreNUG on HV2NUG. And if we log in, our command should still be running. And it is. Check it out. No interruption at all for this machine. So that was a shared nothing live migration, which again is a combination of a live migration, the running state and memory of this VM, as well as a storage migration, all of the underlying data that's associated with it, which wasn't on shared storage. We were using local storage here for this machine. Next up, let's take a look at just a storage migration. So I'm going to close out a CoreNUG here, and let's just take GUI NUG's disks and migrate them over to our file server. Now, before we do this, we actually need to set up the file share over on FSNUG. So let's launch Server Manager here on Admin NUG. Let's choose File and Storage Services on the left. We'll hit the Shares link here, and let's drop down that task menu and choose to create a new share. Now, we need to create an application share for this to work. This has underlying optimizations and settings specifically for Hyper-V. So make sure you choose Applications and hit Next. We're going to specify our share location over there on FSNUG. We'll hit a custom path here and actually created in the root of the C drive a directory called VMs. And there it is. So we'll choose that folder for the local storage for the share. We'll hit Next, and we'll just give this the name VMs. We'll go ahead and hit Next again. We're all good here for these settings. We'll hit Next. And we also need to configure permissions here for these machines. So we're going to hit Customize Permissions. We're going to hit Add. And now we're going to select a principal. We need to add, again, both HV1NUG and HV2NUG. So let's hit Object Types here. Let's choose Computers. Hit OK. And we'll start here with HV1NUG. Add that in here. And we're going to give it full control. Cool. We'll hit OK. And now HV1NUG will be in there. Perfect. Now we need to do the same thing for HV2NUG. So same exact process here. Select Principal. Computer's already selected there. So let's do an HV2NUG. Hit OK. And hit full control and hit OK. Hit OK one more time, and our share is done. So we'll hit Next, and we will create our share. Cool. Now there's one more thing we need to do back in Active Directory. since we've added fsnug into the mix here, we also need to set up constrained delegation on both HV1 and HV2 nug. So let's start with HV1 nug. We'll head over to delegation. We'll hit add. And now we only need to add it in here for CIFS since we're doing a storage migration. This is purely storage here for our file server. So we'll add users and computers here. I'll just hit FS and hit check names to resolve to our file server. Hit OK. And now we just need to choose CIFS. That's it. All right. So that's all we need for storage migration. That's the common information file system, essentially what our file system sit on top of. And we're good there. So we'll hit OK. Now we need to do the same thing for HV2 nug. So hit delegation here, hit add, hit users and computers, type in fsnug here, check names and OK. And make sure we choose CIFS there and hit OK. So now we're good. We've got delegation. We've added fsnug into the mix for both of our Hyper-V hosts. Now we're done, and we can go back in to Hyper-V Manager and perform a storage migration for GUI nug. So we're going to right-click on GUI nug and hit Move. We'll hit Next at the Before We Begin page. This time we're only interested in a storage migration, so we'll choose our second option for our move type and hit Next. Again, we'll keep the move simple here. We'll move it all to a single location, so we'll hit Next. And now I'm just going to type in the path to that share over on fsnug. There it is. You can also browse the network to it as well. We're good here. We'll hit Next, and we're done. Now we hit Finish, and it's going to migrate just our disks, both of those disks. We've got a boot disk and a data disk attached to GUI nug over to that file share on fsnug. And by the way, this will also not interrupt service. Notice we have GUI nug running. We could have did the same thing, logged in, created a long-running process, and that process will still be running once this move is complete. And that's the big benefit here of live migration, hence the term live, right? There's no interruption in service. We can perform migrations with no downtime. My storage migration just completed, and we can prove that it worked by right-clicking on our machine, going into Settings, and choosing either or both of our disks here, and we'll see that they're both now pointing to that shared location over there on our file server. Cool. So now we can perform a live migration, which will be nearly instantaneous, because all it needs to transfer over to HV2 nug is the memory and the machine itself. So let's right-click on that machine, choose to move it, and we'll walk through this lovely wizard one more time. So we'll choose Next at the Before You Begin page. We're going to move the virtual machine, not the storage. Our destination again here is going to be HV2 nug. And once we hit Next, we finally get to choose the third option here, which is just to move the virtual machine. And that's it. We'll hit Next and Finish. And it's done. And that was incredibly fast because it didn't have to migrate over any storage. Just simply the VM and its memory. And here it is, by the way, over on HV2 nug. In this CBT Nugget, we learned how to implement Hyper-V migration. We saw how to configure live migration at the server level, how to configure authentication protocols, and then we looked at each migration type: shared nothing live migration, storage migration, and live migration. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.